Richard sat on his small bed, staring at his laptop screen. His heart pounded as he watched the notification on his freelance account. $5,000 received. His hands trembled, his eyes widened. Yes! 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 He screamed, punching the air in excitement. He had just landed his first big gig, and the payment had finally come in. It felt unreal. He looked around his tiny, stuffy room and grinned. Finally, he muttered, I can move to a better place. Without wasting time, he grabbed his phone and dialed Benjamin's number. The moment his friend picked up, Richard shouted, Benji, I don't blow! Benjamin laughed. Which way, nah? Talk to me. Remember that gig I told you about? Richard said, breathing fast. Guy, dem don't pay me. $5,000, Benjamin whistled. Omo, you don't hammer. Where we day turn up? We go club tonight, Richard declared. That evening, Richard and Benjamin met at a popular nightclub. The music was loud, the drinks flowed freely, and they danced like kings. Richard felt like a champion. His days of struggling in a small, hot room were over. He was finally stepping into the big boys' league. When the party ended, Richard was too tired to go home, so he followed Benjamin to his apartment. The next morning, as he stretched and yawned, he told Benjamin, Guy, I need a new house. A fine one. No more trenches life. Benjamin nodded. I fit link you up with my agent. The guy sabi find house. Richard's eyes lit up. Yes, Abeg, but I need a virgin house. Benjamin frowned. Virgin house? Yes, Richard said firmly. Brand new. No one don lived there before. Benjamin sighed. Richard, no makes sense. House we people don live inside before in a better house. New houses fit get issue. Richard laughed. All those your Nollywood stories no concern me. I want fresh house. Benjamin shook his head but didn't argue further. The next day, they met the agent who showed them a newly built apartment. It was beautiful. Spacious, clean, and modern. Guy, this house too fresh, Richard said, grinning. If I bring babe here, she go no say I be big boy. Benjamin still had doubts, but he agreed the house looked good. Richard wasted no time making payments. Other tenants also arrived, excited to move in. That evening, Richard and Benjamin returned to Benjamin's place. Tomorrow I go arrange my house, Richard said. The next day, Richard bought new furniture, a big television, an air conditioner, and a brand new laptop for work. By nightfall, his apartment was fully set. Benjamin smiled at him. Omo, na big boy level you day now. Richard leaned back on his couch, smiling. Yes, now let the real hustle begin. But Richard had no idea his nightmare was about to start. A week after moving into his new apartment, Richard felt like a king. His business was booming and life was good. Every evening he sat in his well-furnished sitting room, sipping cold drinks while working on his laptop. One night, after a long day of work, he lay in bed, feeling proud of himself. Just as he was about to sleep, loud music suddenly blasted from his sound system. Richard jumped up, his heart racing. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. His sound system was on, playing music at full volume. He frowned. I swear I turned this thing off. Shaking his head, he walked to the sound system and switched it off. Just as he was about to turn back, his television came on by itself. Channels flipped rapidly, making a loud clicking sound. Richard froze. His throat felt dry. Slowly, he walked toward the TV and turned it off. The room fell silent again. Maybe no wiring problem, he muttered to himself, forcing a laugh. He got back into bed and covered himself with a blanket. For the next few days, nothing strange happened. Everything felt normal again. Meanwhile, unknown to Richard, other tenants were also experiencing strange occurrences. Doors creaked open on their own, lights flickered, and whispers echoed through the hallways at night. But everyone kept quiet. They didn't want to sound crazy. One evening, Richard brought home a lady named Sandra. They had fun, laughing and enjoying each other's company. But around 3 a.m., Sandra suddenly started shivering. Richard panicked. Babe, are you okay? Sandra hugged herself, her teeth chattering. I don't know what's wrong, she whispered. Richard's heart pounded. He had heard stories of men whose girlfriends died in their apartments, leading to police investigations. Sandra, you should have told me if you were sick, he said, his voice shaking. If something happens to you now, whetten I go tell my people? Sandra's face darkened with anger. So you think I came here to die? She snapped. I'm leaving. She grabbed her bag and stormed out. Richard watched her go, still feeling uneasy. Early the next morning, he called Benjamin. Guy, I almost killed person daughter last night. Benjamin laughed. How? Richard explained what happened. She just started shivering. I swear, I thought she was about to die. Benjamin chuckled. Omo, maybe you too rugged for her. They laughed it off, not knowing that Richard's problem was far from over. That night, just as Richard had forgotten about the strange incidents, it happened again. Loud music blasted from his sound system. His television turned on by itself, flipping through channels at a crazy speed. Richard's body turned cold. His heart pounded. What the hell? He quickly ran to the sound system and turned it off, but the music kept playing. His hands trembled as he reached for the television remote. He pressed the power button, but nothing happened. A shiver ran down his spine. Which kind wiring problem be this? The next morning, he called an electrician to check the house. After inspecting everything, the electrician shook his head. Oga, your wiring day okay? No problem anywhere. Richard frowned. Then why my sound system and TVD on by themselves? The electrician sighed. Just unplug them before you sleep. That night, Richard did exactly as he was told. He unplugged the television and sound system from the sockets and lay down to sleep. But at exactly 2 a.m., the music blasted again. The TV turned on. Richard sat up immediately, his heart in his throat. He turned to the socket. His eyes widened in horror. The TV was still unplugged. His body turned to ice. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He took slow steps toward the sitting room, his legs shaking. Just as he reached the middle of the room, the door to his bedroom slammed shut with a loud bang. Richard screamed. Then, from inside the walls, he heard laughter. Cold, eerie laughter that sent chills through his entire body. Richard stood frozen, unable to move. His lips trembled, his breath came in short gasps. Then the laughter slowly faded. His TV and sound system turned off on their own. The room fell into dead silence. Richard didn't move. He didn't blink. He was too scared to even breathe. Something was very wrong with this house. The next morning, Richard left his apartment without looking back. He wasn't sure where he was going. He just needed to be around people. He walked aimlessly through the streets, trying to convince himself that everything had a logical explanation. Maybe he was too stressed. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something was inside that house with him. He called Benjamin. Guy, I no fit stay this house again. Benjamin laughed. Why, you dey fear ghost? Richard's mouth went dry. He swallowed hard. I no go lie, Benji. Something no pure for this apartment. Benjamin sighed. Omo, no start this thing a beg. You no say na lagos we day, if it be rat or bad wiring. Richard shook his head. Benji, I unplugged everything, but the music still played. The TV still came on. Silence. Benjamin finally spoke, his voice lower. Omo, it be like say Nollywood, donde show for your side. Richard exhaled shakily. Abeg, make I crash for your side tonight. Benjamin agreed, but when night came, Richard felt foolish. Maybe he was overreacting. He decided to return home and face his fears. But as soon as he entered the house, he felt it. The air was heavy. It was as if something was watching him. Waiting. He locked the door and moved straight to his bedroom. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't want to see anything strange. He lay on the bed, heart pounding, eyes wide open. The silence in the house was too loud. Then he heard it. A whisper. Soft, chilling, and right beside his ear. Richard's body stiffened. He could feel warm breath on his neck. His skin crawled. He turned slowly, his hands shaking, towards the direction of the whisper. Nothing. The room was empty. He reached for his phone, trying to turn on the flashlight. But before he could press the button, something moved in the corner of the room. A shadow. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His fingers froze over his phone screen. The shadow didn't move like a normal shadow. It wasn't cast by light. It had shape. And then it turned. Two glowing red eyes stared at him from the darkness. Richard felt his soul leave his body. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The shadow took a slow step forward. Richard bolted out of bed. He grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it at the corner. Nothing. The shadow was gone. But the feeling didn't leave. The air still felt heavy. The room still felt wrong. And Richard knew, without a doubt, he was not alone. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in bed, back pressed against the wall, flashlight in hand, heart racing. He was afraid to close his eyes. Every time he blinked, he saw those red eyes in the darkness. By morning, his body was weak. His head ached, but he had made up his mind he had to leave this house. He called Benjamin immediately. Guy, I swear I dey move out today. That thing I see last night, no be ordinary. Benjamin hesitated. What thing? Richard's voice dropped. Shadow with red eyes, Benjamin sighed. Richard, be like say stress don day affect you. You sure say no be dream? Richard's patience snapped. Benji, no be dream. I see am. The thing day my room. Guy, I swear, I no fit stay here again. Benjamin finally agreed to come over, but deep down, Richard knew he wouldn't understand. When Benjamin arrived, he looked around the house, unimpressed. Everything looks normal to me. Richard shook his head. Na so he be during the day, but when night come, na another thing. Benjamin walked around, inspecting every corner. Then he turned to Richard. Make we try one thing. We go leave your phone camera on and record overnight. If anything happen, we go see Am. Richard hesitated, but he agreed. He was desperate to prove he wasn't crazy. That night, they set up the phone in the sitting room, facing the hallway. Then Benjamin left, promising to check on him in the morning. Richard locked all the doors and windows. He made sure everything was unplugged. He kept a knife under his pillow. Then he lay down, staring at the ceiling. Hours passed. Midnight. Everything was silent. Then, at exactly 2:33 a.m., the TV turned on. Richard shot up from the bed. The remote was still on the table. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He reached for his second phone, but before he could call Benjamin, something else happened. The sound system came on. A deep, slow laugh echoed through the room. Richard's blood turned to ice. Then the whisper came again. Richard. His phone slipped from his fingers. His body refused to move. Then, bang! The bedroom door slammed shut. Richard screamed. He jumped from the bed, ran to the door, and yanked it open. But the hallway was not the same. The walls were darker, the air was heavy, and at the end of the hallway, a figure stood watching him. Richard's legs refused to move. His heart pounded like a drum. The figure had no face, just two glowing red eyes. Then it took a step forward. Richard turned and ran back into the room, slamming the door behind him. He grabbed his phone, struggling to dial Benjamin's number, but the screen was frozen. Then the voice came again. You can't leave. The air turned ice cold. Richard could see his breath in the room. Then, silence. Everything stopped. Richard stood there, shaking. He didn't know if he was dead or alive. The next morning, Benjamin found him sitting on the floor, eyes wide, body trembling. Richard looked up at him and whispered, "We need to check the recording." Benjamin grabbed Richard's phone and quickly searched for the video. His hands were shaking, but he pressed play. At first, nothing happened. The room was quiet. The clock ticked. The camera faced the hallway. Everything seemed normal. Then, at exactly 2:33 a.m., the TV turned on. Benjamin gasped. His grip on the phone tightened. A few seconds later, the sound system came on by itself. The speakers blasted music at full volume. Then, a shadow appeared. It was standing at the end of the hallway. Benjamin paused the video. His voice was barely above a whisper. Richard, wet'n be this? Richard swallowed hard. Just play Am. Benjamin pressed play. The shadow didn't move at first. But then it started walking. The closer it came, the darker the room became. Then the red eyes appeared. Richard turned away from the phone. He didn't want to see it again. Benjamin's hands were shaking. Guy, you mean say na wet'n happen for this house? Richard nodded. Benjamin quickly stopped the video. He couldn't watch anymore. He turned to Richard, his face pale. We need to leave this house, now. Richard was already packing. He grabbed his laptop, phone, and a small bag with his documents. He didn't care about the furniture, the TV, or anything else. He just wanted to leave. They ran out of the house and jumped into Benjamin's car. As Benjamin started the engine, Richard glanced back at the building. For a brief second, he thought he saw the red eyes watching from the window. Then they drove off. Richard didn't speak. He just sat in silence, staring at the road. Benjamin finally broke the silence. Richard, we need to find out who built that house. Richard sighed. I just want to forget everything. Benjamin shook his head. No. If we no find out, who knows whether this thing go follow you, go your new house. Richard's stomach twisted. The thought alone made him feel sick. Benjamin continued. We go find the agent we rent out the house. Him go tell us everything. Richard hesitated, then nodded. Whatever was in that house wasn't normal. And if it had followed him before, who was to say it wouldn't happen again? They had to find the truth. Benjamin parked the car in front of a small office. The paint on the walls was fading, and a rusty sign above the door read, Homes and Properties. Richard and Benjamin stepped out of the car, glancing at each other. Richard's heart pounded. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the truth, but he knew he had no choice. They entered the office. Behind a wooden desk sat a young man wearing glasses. He looked up from his newspaper and frowned. "Ah, Mr. Richard," the agent said, forcing a smile. "How your new house?" Richard and Benjamin exchanged a look. Benjamin didn't waste time. He slammed his hand on the table. "Bros, I beg, who built that house?" The agent's smile disappeared. His face grew serious. "Why unade ask?" Richard leaned in. "Because the house no normal." His voice shook. "Go stay there." The agent adjusted his glasses, looking uncomfortable. "I know no wetin unade talk," Benjamin scoffed. "You want lie? You sell house we go stay live inside, and you want tell us say you no." The agent sighed. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Oh yeah, sit down." Richard and Benjamin pulled up chairs. The agent's voice dropped to a whisper. The house was built by a man named Chief Okafor. Richard felt a chill. That name sounded familiar. The agent continued. "Chief Okafor be big politician, very rich, but him do things we know pure." Richard swallowed hard. "Which kind things?" The agent leaned in closer. "Chief Okafor be ritualist." Benjamin gasped. Richard's stomach turned. The agent nodded. "People say he used 5 women for sacrifice when him day build that house. 5 young women we nobody fit find again, dem disappear." Richard shivered. "Jesus Christ," the agent sighed. "After the house finish, Chief Okafor never stay there. One day him just die for sleep. Nobody know what and kill am." Benjamin shook his head. "And Una still day rent out the house?" The agent spread his hands. "Business na business." Richard's fists clenched. "So Una sabi say people go suffer, but Una no care?" The agent avoided their eyes. "We no force Una rent am." Richard felt sick. His body was cold, but his palms were sweaty. He stood up. "Benjamin, let's go." Benjamin got up, giving the agent a long, disgusted look. "Oga, if anything do my guy, you go explain." The agent didn't respond. As they left the office, Richard's legs felt weak. The truth was worse than he expected. That night, Richard laid on the couch in Benjamin's apartment. He drifted into a deep sleep and saw himself back at his apartment. Richard's legs trembled. His breath came in short gasps. He wanted to run, but his body refused to move. The 5 women were now fully visible. They took slow steps toward him, their black eyes locked on him. Their smiles never faded. "You took what is ours," one of them whispered. "You stayed in our house." Another added, "You shouldn't have come here." A third woman spoke, her voice sharp like broken glass. Just then he woke up, his body shaking, sweat all over his body. He didn't bother waking Benjamin, who was sleeping soundly in his room. He knew he had to do something. These women won't let him be, no matter where he went to. He opened the door and left the house. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to do something. As he walked aimlessly down the street that early morning, he spotted a small roadside church and ran inside. The old pastor who was praying inside looked up in surprise. "Help me," Richard cried, slamming the door shut behind him. The pastor stood up. "Calm down, young man. What is chasing you?" Richard struggled to catch his breath. "Ghosts. 5 women. Their house. They won't let me go." The pastor's face darkened. He slowly nodded. "I know the house you speak of." Richard's eyes widened. "You do?" The pastor motioned for Richard to sit. "Many people have lived there. None of them lasted. Some went missing. Others, well, you survived." Richard shuddered. "What do I do? I don't want to die." The pastor picked up his Bible. "They marked you. That's why they still follow you." Richard's skin crawled. "So how do I break free?" The pastor placed his hand on Richard's head and began to pray. As the prayer grew louder, the lights in the church flickered. The air turned ice cold. Then the doors flew open. The 5 women floated into the church. Their feet never touched the ground. Richard screamed. The pastor continued praying. His voice was strong, but the spirits only laughed. Then one of them pointed at Richard. "You can't escape us," she hissed. The others joined in. "Wherever you go, we will follow." Richard shut his eyes. He didn't know what to do. He had nowhere left to run. Then, boom! A loud thunderclap shook the church. The spirits shrieked. Their bodies flickered like a bad television signal. The pastor raised his Bible higher. "You have no power here. Leave this boy alone." The women let out a final ear-piercing scream before their bodies vanished into thin air. The room fell silent. Richard opened his eyes. They were gone. Tears streamed down his face. He dropped to his knees, shaking. The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are free now, my son." Richard nodded slowly, his body still trembling. I can't believe it's over." The pastor sighed. "You were lucky. Never rent a house simply because it's beautiful. Young people should cultivate the habit of praying. Evil hides in plain sight." Richard wiped his face. "I will never forget this." Weeks later, Richard shared his story on social media. "Before you rent a house, do proper research. Many houses are built with blood money. Evil is real." His story went viral. People shared their own encounters with haunted houses. Richard had survived, but he would never forget. If you enjoyed this story, remember to share with your friends and family, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more amazing stories.